Hello and welcome back. We'll continue with our last two speeches now. I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Michal Frankl, my dear friend and colleague. Michal, I don't have to introduce him too much probably here. Michal is a senior researcher at the Masaryk Institute and Archives of the Czech Academy of Sciences. He's also the principal investigator of the ERC consolidator project Unlikely Refugees and Citizens in East Central Europe in the 20th century. And he also participates in the European Holocaust research infrastructure as work package leader and national coordinator of its Czech node. Michal will talk about stateless voices, reconstructing the views and claims of marginalized Holocaust refugees from Austria. I'm very much looking forward to your speech, Michal.
Thank you, Wolfgang, for this very nice introduction. Let me just start my presentation. Wonderful. So first of all, we're almost on the margin of this workshop, so thanks so much for staying. Let me begin with a quote from what I think is a precarious document. Quote, 4 weeks ago, without any statement of the reason, I was arrested, then held together with my 2 daughters in the prison at the Elisabeth Promenade in Vienna, not so far from here. And today, under the surveillance of a police officer, we were transported by the railway to Retz, and from there, on foot, through the forest to the Czechoslovak border. So testified Pesia Lea Rothenberg, who was 61 years old at the time, who was detained while attempting to cross the border between Austria and Czechoslovakia in May 1938. Illegally, at least from the perspective of Czechoslovak border officers. Rothenberg and her daughters were among a large number of Austrian Jews who were, just after the Anschluss, driven by force from their homes and across the nearest border. Some of these expulsions, and that's particularly the case of Burgenland Jews who were deported in groups to Czechoslovak, Hungarian or Yugoslav borderlines, some of these cases are quite well known today and documented, also thanks to Johnny Moser, who's part of this story both as an eyewitness, an expellee, but also as a historian. Yet, I would argue, the story of Rothenberg and that of Jews who originated from Poland, or what became Poland after the First World War, this story remains on the sideline of the Austrian Holocaust research, even though, numerically, Rothenberg was part of a massive refugee movement. Hence, in this short paper, I'm pursuing 2 interconnected aims. I will first try to identify a specific gap in research and documentation of the Holocaust in Austria, and perhaps more broadly in the research about the history of Holocaust-era refugees. And in the second part, I will explore one specific type of source and I'll try to indicate the methodological complexity of its reading. So the first part is a kind of exclamation mark, and the second part is more of a question mark. But let me first give you a few facts and a few numbers so that we know how big the phenomenon was. We know that after the Anschluss, against the background of the Anschluss pogrom, foreign Jews were often the first ones to be expelled, often after they were fired, after their property was confiscated in a very chaotic process. And this didn't affect only Polish Jews, and we know that consulates of other countries were busy intervening on behalf of their mishandled, imprisoned and robbed Jewish citizens, and mostly they intervened in vain. So the flight of Polish Jews or stateless Jews with roots in interwar Poland was one of the first forced migrations from Austria after the Anschluss. I mean, of course, not every Polish Jew left illegally or left illegally. But let me just outline two groups and two processes so that we can estimate the significance of this migration. First of all, those who were furnished with valid Polish passports couldn't be hindered from returning to Poland by the Polish border guards. And in the spring of 1938, Czechoslovak officials were registering about 50 such refugees daily. And because they feared that these refugees would stay illegally in Czechoslovakia, they transported them from one border to the other. So while we do not know how many of these refugees crossed through Czechoslovakia to Poland, by extrapolation, we can come to thousands, perhaps 5,000 people. We will never know the exact numbers. My argument is it's a large group. At the same time, Polish officials and Polish politicians and Polish press which all promoted in the years before Jewish emigration from Poland, were alarmed by such return migration. And it is well known that already by the end of March 1938, the Polish parliament, the same, adopted a law which allowed to denationalize Polish citizens living abroad if they lost connection to the homeland. And the head of the consular department of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Viktor Tomir Drimmer, instructed the consulates to no longer issue passports to those who would potentially fall under this revision of citizenship. That very clearly, not only, but very clearly meant Polish Jews living abroad. Hence, the defense line of Polish ethno-national citizenship ran right through Vienna. And the Polish consulate here very apparently was a driving force in the proceeding denationalization of Polish Jews abroad. It stopped providing protection and intervening for those who were imprisoned or attacked or robbed. And very soon the consulate itself suggested to the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs that this denationalization should be sped up. I'm not going to follow this process. It's also relatively well known that the Polish denationalization leads towards the so-called Polnaktion, large-scale deportation of Polish Jews in Germany, including Austria, obviously, to the no man's land in Zbunsin, and then by extension to Kristallnacht. This is an example of a denationalization decree for a Jewish inhabitant of Vienna. So we know that by the beginning of 1939, the Viennese consulate issued no less than 4,500 of such decrees, of which about 3,500 were already approved in Warsaw. And since family members in their citizenship followed the heads of the family, possibly some 10 to 15,000 Polish Jews living in Austria, mostly in Vienna, were denationalized in this way. And effectively, the number of people who were de facto becoming stateless because of that and lived in Austria was even higher, because the process of denationalization was mostly triggered by the person approaching the consulate. But the others also lost the protection. So, and many of those people, again, not all, are driven by force or arrive by themselves to the Czechoslovak border, very often without a passport, like the Rothenberg family with whom I have started. Now, without constructing the fate of this group into a kind of coherent story and coherent trajectory or group with the same kind of identity, I would still argue that their absence in the historiographic representation of the Holocaust of Austrian Jews is striking. And in my view, it sheds light on the construction of the narratives of Austrian Holocaust history. And this exclusion of these so-called Ostjuden stands in real contrast to the significance that is attached in the literature about the history of Jews in Vienna prior to the Anschluss to Jewish immigrants from the East. And of course, the history of Jews in Vienna is the history of immigrants, anyhow. So Harriet Pass-Friedenreich, for instance, described the split between the Western and Eastern type Jews as a crucial phenomenon, crucial for the understanding of Jewish politics during the interwar years. And historians like Robert Wistrich, Marsha Rosenblit, David Rechter followed a similar line. Or we can mention the research about so-called Ostjuden in Vienna, like Klaus Hödel and others, which very often looks at their religious and cultural identity and explores the effects that this group had, formative effects on the Viennese Jewry and its institutions. Likewise, the campaigns against refugees during the First World War and the non-recognition of their citizenship in Austria after the war was very much highlighted in the research. Yet, the consequences of the history of the Holocaust, of this story, for the history of the Holocaust in Austria remain under-researched. So interestingly, these Ostjuden are registered, noticed as immigrants, but not as refugees or immigrants when they leave Austria under force. And we know a lot about emigration of Jews during the Holocaust from Austria in keywords, Eichmann, Zentralstelle, Evian, illegal emigration to Palestine. But again, the departure of Polish and other Eastern Jews is barely noted. In a recent article, Benjamin Grill evaluated his fascinating database of foreign Jews living in interwar Vienna, and he concluded that Jews with prior migration history were more likely to emigrate during the Holocaust. Yet, and this is kind of mantra for me today, this included no reflection in Benjamin's article, no reflection of the mass expulsion of Polish Jews and the specific history, without which, in my view, the data that he collected is hard to understand. So why this omission is perhaps a question to the audience. I think a lot of people here understand Austrian Holocaust history better than I do. But perhaps it has something to do with the long persisting preference for Western countries as the imagined places of emigration and Palestine, or also a form of methodological nationalism. But also I think that the narratives of migration confirm or re-establish the identity and citizenship claims which the rather insecure and contested citizenship of foreign Jews seemed to undermine. In addition to citizenship or origins, I think it is social status, or if you want, class, that played a major role in the exclusion, the historiographic exclusion of this group. So while the call for papers for this workshop highlighted gender, I would focus on class as the reason of marginalization. And that's why I'd like to come back to a source, a type of source that perhaps can help us to bring this group of refugees and class to the center of analysis. Now, while researching Austrian Jewish refugees to Czechoslovakia, and much of this we have done together with Wolfgang, especially for our edition of documents called the Begrenzte Flucht, I've realized I was not very successful in finding testimonies and oral histories, especially for Polish Jews who were expelled from Austria and went through Czechoslovakia or to Czechoslovakia. And so I started to explore other possible types of documents that could identify these refugees and recover their trajectories and perspectives. And as I was examining these documents, trying to approximate to their views and perspectives, agency, or voices if you want. And elsewhere, I have analyzed appeals of Polish and Czechoslovak Jews that were submitted to authorities against denationalization. And I'll just give you, I'm not going to discuss them, I'm just mentioning them as a possible source. This is an example of an appeal submitted again by a Jewish inhabitant, a Polish citizen living in Vienna who was made stateless. The reason I'm mentioning them is that these appeals open a lot of methodological questions, and they can be understood as a form of writing upwards, which establishes a personal narrative link between unequal social actors. And here we can refer to existing research about this type of document. For instance, historians and social scientists observed for refugee applications to NGOs or to governments how categories such as race, gender, class, and national identity shaped refugee claims. This was a kind of an indirect quote from an article by Peter Guttrell and others. And they pointed out the mediation and filtering that takes place in these documents, as well as the diversity and polyphony of refugee voices. And we could also refer to a lot of other research, like Teodora Dragostinova's notion of speaking national, and the fact that such appeals, that speaking national in such appeals or claims is a form of social legitimacy, and a lot of other research which I'm skipping for time reasons. But I'd like to focus on a more precarious source, and it is I'll focus now on a small set of about 20 protocols with refugees who were caught at the Czechoslovak border in the months after the Anschluss, and all of these people were returned immediately to Austria. These are very short protocols, and when I started with the Rothenberg one, I think I've read almost most of it. Look like that. These protocols are not precarious in the archival sense, but they're no easy documents if we should try to read them as a testimony, because that in itself is an intellectual process of interpretation, deconstruction, something that should be done carefully. Yet it is also a chance to capture some of the voice of refugees as recorded in a asymmetrical, unequal power setting. And I would argue that paradoxically, to understand this process of filtering, to get to the refugee voices, we also need to approximate to what border officials were trying to tease out from the refugees' statements. And so in order to extract the voice of refugees, we also have to reconstruct the gaze of the border officials. And so in order to do that, I'd like to locate the story a little bit geographically. Due to the easy train connection from Vienna and the specific geography, which made crossing physically easier here, the very few kilometers around the village of Hnanice, Gnadlersdorf, became one of the key areas for refugee movement. And the protocols were written down by officials of the Czechoslovak Financial Guard, in German that would be the Finanzwache, traditionally the main armed body protecting the border. And interestingly, Hnanice or Gnadelsdorf was a German-speaking village, but the officials were all Czech-speaking, and they came from the outside. The protocols allow us to establish a collective biography, one that is written from the perspective of border guards, focused on identification and categorization. So we know that none of these refugees possessed Austrian citizenship, that few of them could produce a valid passport. Approximately half originated from the territory of interwar Poland, and the rest were labeled as stateless, or their citizenship was somehow uncertain. And some, like Rothenberg, arrived to Vienna as refugees from Galicia during the First World War. This group was also marginalized, not only based on their Jewishness and migration history, but also based on their social status, because they were very much the people on the bottom end of the social ladder. Many were traveling salesmen, arguably very, very poor. Others worked in menial jobs, and they were tailors, and there was a house painter, a waiter, and a baker's apprentice. Now, I was just thinking, what am I going to do with these very short texts? You know, they're very poor textually in comparison to much what we have seen in this workshop. And to make that easier for me, I have decided to deconstruct them by comparing them with unique oral history interviews of Kurt and Erika Raab, siblings, both teenagers, who fled across the same border. They do not belong to this group precisely, but they have a similar experience. And it's two interviews separately taken, describing the same situation. I'll just pick bits and pieces from them to help me with these protocols. The siblings described, I quote, "the most horrible march through the fields," unquote, which is, in my view, as much a description of the landscape as well as their perception and emotion as they were being in between and just cross the border. It is, of course, a reminder how language is important, and it is also a reminder that these protocols that are written in a cold, bureaucratic language of categorization, that these protocols are based on filtering out the full story, the emotional part of the language, which no doubt belonged to what refugees conveyed when they were being questioned. These documents are also a result of a process of translation from German, which the border guards obviously understood, into Czech, and the refugees signed a Czech language version, which they probably didn't understand. Kurt Raab remembered that the officials first took them to their station, that was directly at the border, where they discussed their case in Czech. He couldn't understand it, but the only word he would capture was Palestine. And he assumed, probably correctly, that they were joking and that was about sending them back to Palestine. He also could have misunderstood it, of course. Now, while we know that the Raab siblings, when they crossed the Czechoslovak side, and when they were apprehended, they shouted Flüchtlinge, refugees. So in order to claim a status. But we do not find any such words in the protocols. What we do find is that the officials always made certain to state the fact of the illegal entry. And for instance, in the Rothenberg protocol, she signed that she signed that in Vienna she was actually forced to sign a document claiming that she will cross to Poland through Czechoslovakia in an illegal way, and that for sure was an addition of the border official. Now, it is clear from the protocols that all refugees described what happened to them. They described their arrest and detention in the police station in Elisabethstraße, Elisabeth Promenade. And here I think there's an interesting phenomenon. I infer that what refugees narrated as a proof of unjust persecution and a claim to be recognized as refugees, the border officials interpreted the same text, the same fact, against the pattern of continued expulsion of unwanted vagrants. The very same fact, the imprisonment in the Elisabeth Promenade, received a dramatically diverging meaning. Here we need to go slightly back in time because especially after the establishment of the Austro-fascist regime, 1934, it started raids on unwanted aliens who were brought to collection points close to Vienna, close to Linz, and then they were very often smuggled in small groups across Czechoslovak border. And most of these people were considered vagrant or destitute and thus unwelcome. And in contrast, after the Anschluss, the absolute majority of these refugees crossing illegally were Jewish. Not everyone, but most of them were Jewish. But the categorization, at least for this group, the group who are addressed by these protocols, remained. For the Czechoslovak border officials, the Elisabeth Promenade was a Schubstation, was a place where you concentrate unwanted vagrant people before you deport them. And of course, the Czechoslovak border officials had the experience of sending these people in the other way. Now, these ascriptions notwithstanding, this is a list made in 1934 of people who were caught at the Czechoslovak border, and you can see, contextually, that these were not only Jewish expellees or Jewish refugees. Now, these ascriptions notwithstanding, or directly or through silences, the protocols also testify to refugee agency. So, for instance, Salomon Bart, who was 37 years at the time, stated that he disobeyed the Austrian officials and that he immediately turned back to Austria. However, when he made it to Retz, to the border, to the Austrian border town, he was imprisoned, he was arrested again, and once more dispatched to the border together with another man. And then he was sent back, the protocol was taken, he was sent back to Austria. However, we also know that he was found in Czechoslovakia later. And what is even more interesting is that we know that he was found in Czechoslovakia with his wife and a daughter, which was 6 years old. And apparently they crossed the border on the same day as he did, yet they're not mentioned here at all. So these silences, I think, are also an interesting testimony. I have no way to interpret them, but an interesting testimony about this type of document, but also human agency. Now, I'll cut a little bit here and come to conclusion. I'm almost finished. In conclusion, I try to argue that reading these rather precarious border protocols, as challenging as this is, that it also offers a way to map trajectories and reconstruct at least some of the agency to refugees who were marginalized and for whom we have no better, more narrative sources. And of course, teasing out their voices also means that we need to use our knowledge of the context, the spatial context, the administrative context, the power structures, and that we have to work ourselves through the interaction with the border guards and of course others, and take into account the categorizing gaze of the state. The Hranice protocols and other similar sources provide an opportunity to look at the Holocaust of Austrian Jews from the margins, and from the margins in multiple sense. It's the distance of the border of the state, both the physical border, but also the border of the citizenship, but also through the social hierarchy, which as I've already mentioned, is mirrored in the existing historiography. And albeit we invoke, rather often we invoke transnational approaches and transnational research, I think this is an example how sources in Czechoslovak, Polish and other archives could be mobilized, if that's the right word, could be mobilized to fill in the gap and perhaps change our perspective in a way which might not be dissimilar to how research about the exile of Polish Jews in the Soviet Union modified the history of the Holocaust in Poland. And from a broader perspective, reading of such documents might be an incentive to reconsider the role of class in documenting and writing the history of refugees during the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you, Michal, for this great speech. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, and I will have a lot of questions to you about it as well, perhaps afterwards. But we will continue now with our last speaker of the session, Jon Popa. Jon Popa is currently a research associate working for an ARC project based at the University of Manchester and examining Jewish dissidents in the Eastern Bloc. I will not go into detail about his impressive publication list. I just want to say that I was allowed to witness that Jon Popa is really a specialist on modern European history. I've done so in several conferences where I've seen him, and he has a focus on Holocaust, religion and politics, and Jewish-Christian relations. He will talk today about forgotten archives, forgotten stories, the persecution of Zionists in communist Romania in the context of Jewish dissidents between 1945 and 1955. Jon, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone from an unusually sunny and bright Manchester. I hope you can hear me. It is a great pleasure to attend this excellent conference and to learn from these very rich presentations. I will start. In 1941-1942, the Romanian state and its leader, Ion Antonescu, pursued a policy of total annihilation of its Jewish community. As a result, according to the final report of the Yale Commission for the Study of the Holocaust in Romania, between 280 and 380,000 Jews were killed at the hands of the Romanians, often independently from the German destruction process. In October 1942, understanding that Germany might not win the war, and in such a case, Romania's position at the future peace conference might be weakened, Antonescu decided to postpone and eventually cancel the deportation to Belzec of approximately 270,000 Jews who were still in the country at the time. At the end of the war, Romania had one of the largest Jewish populations in Europe after the massacres of the Holocaust, with a number varying, according to different reports, between 350 and 430,000. Many of these people, as we will see later on, held Zionist convictions and were willing to immigrate to Palestine. Research on the fate of Zionists in Romania in the immediate post-war year is scanty, with very few articles or book chapters on this topic in English. In Romanian, there are a handful of studies looking at the biographies of several prominent Zionist leaders and their relationship with the Jewish community and the communist regime. Post-communist historiographical needs can explain in part this lack of research. During the 1990s, the intellectual debate in Romania was centered on the local participation in the Holocaust and the role of Ion Antonescu in the murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews. As a result, most historians focused their attention on those events. Only a few ventured to look at the fate of the Jewish community after 1945, amongst them Liviu Rotman, Radu Ioanid, Lucian Năstase Kovac, Harry Kuller, Karol Iancu, or Rafael Vago. Several studies examine the biographies of a few Zionist leaders, such as Abraham Leib Zisu and Theodor Lovenstein-Lavie. However, in most cases, the focus was on their interwar and wartime activities. In the first decade after the fall of communism, several collections of documents on the fate of the Jewish community, including on Zionists, were published. While collections on the events of the Holocaust generated historiographical studies on wartime period, those about the fate of Zionists did not. This strengthened the argument of historiographical priorities mentioned above. Although access to several archives pertinent to the fate of Zionists in Romania has been opened for the last 10-15 years, not so many studies have focused on this topic until now. Apart from the reasons mentioned above, another factor hindering such research is the massive number of documents. Only in the Council for the Study of the former Securitate archives, there are hundreds, if not thousands of files dealing with this topic, which is by no means marginal. It's marginal only because it's not so much researched. The persecution of Zionists in Romania is linked to a plethora of important themes, such as the fate of Holocaust survivors in the immediate post-war years, the persecution of Jews in communist countries, Jewish dissidents, the evolution of communist political anti-Semitism, or the immigration to Palestine. My paper today tries to explore some of the aspects related to the persecution of Zionists in the context of Jewish dissidents. Albert Hirschman, in a book published in 1970 and a subsequent article published in 1978, used the concepts of exit and voice to explain relation of dissidents with the communist state. The exit side of dissidents can be visible in Romania in the fact that the majority of Jews prefer to leave, exit the country when offered the opportunity. This was the most obvious sign of displeasure towards the regime. In the space of 4 decades, the community decreased from approximately 430,000 in 1946 to less than 20,000 in 1989. In comparison to other countries in the Eastern Bloc, the voice side of Jewish dissidents was similar in some respects and entirely different in others. However, today I will only focus on the voice slash dissidents as it was manifested in the persecution of Zionists, which was accompanied by increasing anti-Semitism of the communist authorities. There were strong Zionist organizations in Romania before the Holocaust, but the events of the war led to even more Jews embracing the idea of immigration to Palestine as a way of escaping persecution and death. A June 1946 bulletin of the Bucharest police listing Jewish organizations in the capital contains 31 entries. Of the 31 organizations mentioned, 20 were Zionist. The communists started persecuting Zionists already in 1945. This was in itself an indication that the interwar and wartime anti-Semitic discourse did not die out, but channeled to other themes. The clearest example of this continuity was offered by Vasile Luca, one of the main communist leaders of that era. In a 5th of October 1945 meeting discussing the relations between the party and its subordinate mass organizations, including the National Jewish Committee, a precursor to the later Jewish Democratic Committee. The meeting was attended by several high-ranking communist officials, some of them of Jewish origin, tasked with overseeing the compliance of the community with the new regime. During the meeting, Vasile Luca, pictured here, who was at the time the leading state official with an oversight over Jewish affairs, initially let other participants express their views as to how to best bring the community into full compliance with the regime. Some of the opinions expressed, including from communists of Jewish origin, were heavily anti-Semitic. For example, Like Abramovich Kiriță, who would become the first president of the Jewish Democratic Committee, used vitriolic language when referring to Zionists, language similar to that promoted by interwar anti-Semites, and this is the first quote here. "We don't have the right to bury our heads in the sand and ignore a problem which exists in Romania, to let a few kikes rubble on the streets without doing anything," end of quote. In his long intervention, Vasile Luca seemed to support at the beginning the old Soviet policy, according to which Jews have to leave their identity behind and align to the communist aspiration. However, these arguments switched soon to a more nationalist type of anti-Semitism, which saw Jews as aliens and the locals as the true people. Jews could either assimilate to a level where there was no Jewishness left, or be expelled. In the words of Luca, Jews should align, and I quote, to the fate of that respective people, to the economic, political, and social life of people alongside whom it lives, end of quote. While the 1920s, early 1930s Soviet model aimed to replace ethnic or national identity with a communist one, where at least in theory there was no dominant nationality, here Luca argued that Jews in Romania had to identify with the aspirations of the majority national group. He was not pleading for a communist fair society where the ethnic distinctions were cancelled, but for a society where the Romanian communist element was not, disturbed. And I quote again, "We are not against their assimilation, but a measured assimilation into the Romanian mass in the deep democratic spirit. And don't see this useful and right attitude towards Jews as anti-Semitism, because it isn't." That's Luca's version. This was the same type of Romanian interwar anti-Semitism which saw Jews and Romanians as separate entities in an irreconcilable fight. Now we jump in time 3 years to 1948 and examine two other documents. The first one is the 12th December 1948 resolution of the Central Committee of the Communist Party regarding the national question, which in effect led to the ban of Zionist organizations. The second document is an article published on 25th of February 1949 in Scânteia, the main national daily communist newspaper, which further clarify the communist position on Zionism and, by extension, on Jews in general. 1950, a report by Joseph Gordon for the American Jewish Yearbook described how large-scale persecution and violence against Zionist organizations was unleashed by the communists at the beginning of December 1948. That was the preamble of the 12th December meeting of the Political Bureau, which described Zionism as, quote, "a reactionary political national current promoted by Jewish bourgeoisie, which seeks to isolate the Jewish working class from the coexisting peoples, to hinder its fight alongside progressist forces against capitalism and its own bourgeoisie," end of quote. Chapter 4, point B of the National Resolution issued on that occasion stated, and I quote, "The exploiting classes in our country always use the Jewish question as a criminal diversion designed to maintain and strengthen their dominant position in order to exploit the working people. While the imperialist states, using the racism, anti-Semitism diversion, organized pogroms and new ghettos, the USSR solved the national problem. This proves that in a socialist society where the exploitation of a man by another man is no more, Jews are equal with the coexisting peoples, and there isn't anymore any sort of Jewish problem, end of quote. That was a fantastic statement, as it claimed that anti-Semitism was used before by Jews only as a small screen to exploit other people. That was a direct and unequivocal return to the interwar arguments that Jews shouted anti-Semitism only in order to exploit the Romanians. These arguments were expressed again in an unauthored article published in Scânteia on 25 February 1949 and entitled, "Let us uncover Zionism, the poisoned weapon of imperialism." The article claimed that there was a dichotomy between poor Jewish workers and the deceitful Zionists who day after day and hour after hour try to infiltrate into the masses of Jewish workers the nationalist poison of Zionism. Zionist organizations are described as, quote, chauvinist agents of Israeli capitalists and of the imperialists, end of quote. But the most striking claim of this piece is made in a few sentences, which are at the same time a stark warning for Jews who are indirectly blamed for the Holocaust. And quote now, "The Jewish population must take heed and clearly see that the Anglo-American imperialists, who are the puppeteers behind the Zionist incitements, are the same that want to resurrect fascism and Hitlerism to remake West Germany into a new center of Hitlerist aggression, to create new Maidanek, new Dachau or Buchenwald, new crematoria and gas chambers," end of quote. And now for the last part of my presentation, we will jump 5 years to a meeting in January 1953 of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. During these 5 years, many Jewish organizations, Zionists or not, faced persecutions, with thousands of individuals arrested and expecting trials. On 4 March 1949, Party Decision number 197 banned the activity of Joint, ORT, and OSE. These organizations have been very active in Romania after the Holocaust, providing economic and educational help for survivors. In 1950, massive numbers of Zionist leaders were arrested. In most cases, these people were kept in arrest for months and years before being put to trial. According to Teshu Solomovich, between 1949 and 1953, at least 20 trials against various Zionist groups took place in the country. Although arrested in 1950-1951, the trial of the 13 main leaders, amongst them Abraham Zissou, Michu Benvenisti, Jean Cohen, Benjamin Haber, and others, took place on 28th of March 1954. 3 of them were condemned to life imprisonment, others, amongst them Zissou, Cohen, and Benvenisti, to 8 to 20 years imprisonment. Due to international pressure, some were released in the next years. The official accusations were mostly related to claims of espionage for a foreign country and, quote, siding with the imperialist powers, end of quote. In April 1954, the trial of the 41 lesser-known Zionist figures took place, amongst them Leon Itzkar, Aaron Itzkar, Cornel Janku, Janku Mendelovich, and Rachel Mihalovich. Wexler and Popov bring forth documents showing that apart from the trials mentioned by Solomovich, a lot of other smaller groups labeled as Zionist faced persecution, some of them as late as 1958 and 1959. In some cases, people who were liberated in 1955-56 were arrested in 1958. At the beginning of January 1953, news about the doctor's plot in Moscow started to make headlines in Bucharest, with the Jewishness of the alleged conspirators being clearly indicated. A few months earlier, Rudolf Slansky's trial was also followed by the Romanian communist press. This is the context in which the 14th January 1953 meeting of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party took place. The minutes of the meeting showed that the ethnic lines, instead of being solved by now, were getting even stronger. However, the most striking aspect was the discussion on what to do with Jewish places of worship. Josef Kishinevsky, who was of Jewish origin and in charge of the Propaganda and Culture Department at the time, claimed that, quote, the houses of prayer are capitalist factories of espionage. Even more, in a vicious attack, he argued, and this is the second quote here, I believe that Jewish communities are more dangerous than any other Jewish organization, even more so than the Zionist organizations when they were in function, when they were legal. Communities have been all this time nests of spoliators, exploiters, and spy. Screw them. They will cry, but in the end, we will be silent. Otherwise, they will be dangerous not only to us, but to the entire camp of peace. Reducing the number of synagogues can be done and will not raise any complaints from the Jewish working population. End of quote. Kishinevsky's vitriolic diatribe had almost nothing to do with Zionism. It was a clear denunciation of Jewish organizations in general and of Jewish religious institutions and places of worship in particular. Later in his speech, he proposed the banning of Talmud schools. As the virulence of his attack probably surprised some of the participants, Emil Bodnarash, who held important positions in the communist apparatus, including head of security services in the late 1940s and Minister of Defense at the beginning of the 1950s, asked, quote, are there Jewish communities in the Soviet Union? End of quote. To which Miron Constantinescu, a Politburo member of the Central Committee, replied, quote, there are temples, synagogues, but no Jewish communities, end of quote. The dialogue, although very brief, is significant as it shows that in 1953, leading members of the Romanian Communist Party were still oblivious as to how the Soviet Union dealt with the Jewish question. Some of this oblivion, which had been visible in Vasile Luca's October 1945 speech, was generated by lack of knowledge. Many of these people being ignorant about the ways in which the communists tried to solve the problem of anti-Semitism in the 1920s USSR. Another reason generating these dilemmas was related to Stalin's post-Second World War attitudes towards Jews. His increasing anti-Semitism, which was followed closely in Bucharest, encouraged communist anti-Semitism in Romania. However, at the same time, it created some confusion as to how far these attacks could go without stepping outside the line. And concluding, some of the main leaders of Zionist organizations imprisoned and tried at the beginning of the 1950s were released in 1955. But the fate of hundreds of other less known Zionists was harsh, with some of them being condemned to death or murdered in the atrocious communist penitentiary system. According to Solomovich, in 1954, a group of Zionists who reached Israel held a hunger strike protest in front of the Great Synagogue in Tel Aviv, asking for the Israeli authorities to do more for the liberation of at least 500 Asirei Zion members who were detained in Romanian prisons. He also brings forth evidence about the physical and mental torture suffered by imprisoned Zionists in penitentiaries such as Gerla, Aiud, and Pitești. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jon. Thanks. That was quite impressive. I will not say too much now because I can see already that there are questions here and there's also a question in the forum already. Let me just say that we have heard very different narratives of marginalization today and very different stories. Just to remind you, because it was a long panel, we started with Marta Havriško talking about the Jewish women talking about rape on the trial of the Soviet war crime trials. We've heard from Frank Grelka about the voices of the Jewish poor from forced labor camps in the general government. We've heard from Dora about the newly discovered Holocaust-related documents from the archives of the Center's Jewish community. We've heard, of course, from Michal as well about this marginalized Polish or former Polish Holocaust refugees from Austria, and now we've heard of the persecution of Zionists and communist Romania by Jon. I think they're all very different. They are not always precarious in the terms of precarious archives, but what we've heard sometimes now, they're precarious in the terms that they were not researched for a very long time. I think that's something that they all have in common, this omission in research. I mean, with the exemption perhaps of this very early 1947 memorial, but then still the documents afterwards were lost again. This, of course, brings me to the question, what is the reason for this? And I think we've heard about this a little bit already. My question to all of you then later during the answer other questions would be, what is the reason for this? Is it only that there are marginalized groups? Is it only that there are different cultural ideas about these different groups? And I mean, Michal has answered this already quite extensively, so I would like to add something to you, and that is this an omission in research because it has been the example of Polish or stateless former Polish citizens, or doesn't this have something to do as well with the lack of research in general about refugees from Austria going to Eastern European countries? So what's the difference here between these things? I'll just, with this, open the discussion, and I think we are ready to have a round of questions.
All right, thank you. I'll try to keep my questions as succinct as possible. Marta, I had just a quick one for you, which was actually regarding this photograph of the man on the mass graves, the man who was accused of rape, and then there's this picture of him standing on these mass graves. I was wondering if you could talk about how in the world that happened. Why there's a picture of him standing there, what year that was. Michal, thank you so much for introducing class. It's something that interests me a lot in my research in Romania, and I see it also really pushed to the side. I feel like it's still also in Vienna. I see all the time, it's almost like there's still this struggle, this desire to show how Viennese, how Austrian the Jews were. Look, they were just like us, just the same clothes, just the same language, everything. And I wonder, and this is the same thing in Cluj, there's the assimilated Hungarian population there. When they talk about the Holocaust, it's that population, even though there was a very large Yiddish-speaking and very religious community there, and this community is like completely silenced. And I always wonder, why is this? And is it because perhaps for researchers and the public today, it is difficult or uncomfortable to talk about the fact that actually they weren't assimilated. Maybe these groups didn't speak the same language, and they did dress differently, and they weren't educated in the same way. And if there's some sort of difficulty for us as researchers, for museums to talk about that, actually, if you want to comment about that with your work. And then, Jon, it was wonderful to see you, and thank you so much for this project, and I'm going to be in touch with you. I work on the same period, I think, as you know, from the perspective of a woman, a Jewish woman who is in Romania, who joined Zionist organizations, however, very ambivalently, and then left them. And so what struck me about your presentation was that it was the sources were from the authorities and from the outside, and not the Jewish voices. And which is fine, there has to be both perspectives. But my comments then have to do with thinking about how many of these people that were Zionists in numbers were actually intent to go to Palestine, because my research has revealed they mostly just wanted to get out, and maybe you've come across this too. There's a few articles and things published about this. People just wanted to get out, and if a Zionist organization said they would get them out, then they would be Zionists. And if somebody else said they would do it, then they would switch quickly organizations to just whoever could work that out. And on that note, also I love the newspaper articles that you used, and the paranoia that comes through. I felt like from the 1949, I think those articles were. And I also encountered this in the Ceausescu archives, where they were in Constanza. The secret police were still spying on these Zionists, these people who had been leaders of the Zionist organizations in the 40s. They had, in the late 50s, lists of them. Still, their names, who are they, where did they, and they were almost all gone, placat in Israel, or Palestine, and they were still keeping track, though, of this. So there is this paranoia, I feel like, from the communist state towards Zionism, which is something that I'm still also trying to think about and reflect on and figure out, and if you want to maybe talk about that at all, thank you.
Yes, I think we'll stop here because it's too many questions at once. Otherwise, and I'll open the floor for the answers.
Should we start with Marta?
Yes, let's start with Marta. Marta, you are muted still?
Yeah, she is.
Maybe she didn't hear. I think she didn't know that she's supposed to answer that.
All right, then.
So let's do Jon, and then start with them.
Then let's start with Jon, yes. Mm-hmm. Jon.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for the questions, Julie. Yes, we'll definitely be in touch, because this topic is a bit new to me. It's part of the project I'm involved in since February. But it is, in a sense, eye-opening, because as many other historians of Romanian history, I have been focused in the last decade mostly on wartime and interwar period, and all of a sudden I'm discovering these very interesting documents and this very interesting topic, which is not explored, and it's still very relevant, because we are talking about hundreds of thousands of survivors, Holocaust survivors in Romania, and their fate. Now, there was a big debate in Romania during the interwar and even during the war between Wilhelm Fildermann, who was the president of the Jewish community during the war, and Zissou, Abraham Zissou. Zissou was the main Zionist, not only leader, but thinker. Fildermann was not a Zionist, and there was a debate between these two great figures about how best to protect the interest of Romanian Jews. There is a paper written by Camelia Crăciun. I don't know if that name is in any way known to you. She wrote a good paper on this debate between Fildermann and Zissou. Now, I think it's not very easy to say how many of these people were truly Zionist. My guess is that many of them were indeed truly Zionist, but of course there were others who, as you said, wanted to leave, and if Zionist organizations offered an escape route, then they definitely grabbed that opportunity. Now, about the paranoia, that's a very interesting aspect, and I think the paranoia of the communist authorities could be explained because they fear about what these people once away from Romania would say about the communist regime. And actually, there is a dialogue, a very interesting dialogue, I think in 1955, between Emil Bodnaraș, who was one of the main communist leaders of Romania at the time, and Chief Rabbi Moses Rosen. Rosen was intervening for some prominent Zionist leaders to be allowed to leave Romania, amongst them Zisu and Lowenstein Lavi. And Bodnaraș told the chief rabbi, we would like to allow them to leave, but what if, when they arrive in Israel, they would start talking badly about the communist regime? And it seems that Zisu told the chief rabbi Rosen that, and I don't have the exact quote, but the idea was that as long as a Jew was left in Romania and in danger, if he was in Israel, he would not talk badly about the regime, because he didn't want to endanger the lives of Jews left in the country in any way. But the paranoia of the communist authorities continued, and they probably, I think this is the main reason why they kept tabs. They still kept an evidence of where these people went and what they said and so on.
Thank you. Hand over to you, Michal.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions, and they can be very well combined. And so, in order to think about why this topic, this group is so underrepresented, I think it's a convergence of several reasons. One obviously was very much on my mind, also in my larger project, the imagination of East Central Europe, or spaces outside of what we define as Western democracies, etc., where these are imagined as spaces to leave rather than to escape to. And of course, fleeing to Czechoslovakia, which is turning towards an authoritarian regime and is going to be occupied soon, and even more fleeing to Poland is just against this imagination. But it's not. And obviously, it also tells us something about the temporal context of these narratives. This is, I think, a lot of this is this kind of exclusion in research. I think is based on already, I think, wartime perceptions, but especially post-Second World War narratives. And I think it's the Cold War context that contributes to this very obviously. But there are more reasons, and I think one of them is the lack of sources. My assumption, but it's a speculation, but my assumption is that fewer of these Polish or Eastern Jews returned to Vienna after the war, but that's not based on any research. And hence there's less sources collected in archives like the Dokumentationsarchiv, for instance, or in oral history collections in Austria. And generally it's a problem with connecting sources that are scattered in archives in different countries. I mentioned this, and it's something we really talk about for ages. And we see that still connecting, literally to use Iris slogans, connecting archives still makes sense. And I think there can be many other examples brought, not only this one. But I'd say it's also, and I think importantly, an identity issue. Migration and identity are clearly connected. And migration is a problem for identity, not being settled. And especially, I think, for German-speaking Jews in the tradition of researching the Holocaust of German Jews, and I would include Austrian Jews here as well, migration is in contrast to assimilation. And that also was the perception of say, Jewish organizations or aid organizations after 1933. It took them time to realize that immigration is a way to is a necessity, so to say. So I think this connection to emancipation or contrast between migration and emancipation is something which also contributes to these post-war narratives. And perhaps one more and last thing I will say is the focus on middle-class Jews. That is related, I think, to the successful path of emancipation. I can mention Marion Kaplan's book on Jewish refugees to Portugal. And don't get me wrong, this is a wonderful book and one of the most important books about Jewish refugees during the Holocaust. But it's also one which is very clearly focused on middle-class Jews. And it's, if you read it from this perspective, you will find the reference to middle-class identity repeated as something which was very important for these refugees and for our understanding of them.
Thanks. Do you want to add some comments?
Yeah, I just want to say, maybe from the perspective of my research, I can add three aspects. First is that the forced labor, we tend to think that this had any economic purpose, that these laborers were recompensated or got any resources from the labor, and this waterworks, which they had not, of course. The second aspect is an empirical reason, as you already said. So obviously we don't have any or much documentation of these laborers, but we still have the perspective of those who survived. And when those who survived silence about the voices who had not survived, we can learn, I guess, much about the conditions under which the majority actually had to labor and try to survive these labor camps. And this connects to the third aspect, I guess. It's our approach. We tend as historians to look on the perpetrators and on the victims' perspective, and somehow we reconstruct the power relations on the ground during the Holocaust when we limit to the sources. So we really need to enclose in our research the perspective of the majority who might have not a voice in the documents, but still the majority is there. And this is a kind of perspective I try to apply to my own research project.
Thank you. Further questions?
Martha answer?
Martha, can you hear us?
Maybe write in the chat.
Okay. Kannst du das vielleicht dann machen? Well, any other questions from the room now? Before we continue. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and apologize for additional sound effects during the two sessions. Marta, do you hear me? Yeah, great. I wanted to start. Do you hear?
Yes, Natalia.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you for this paper. So I was wondering if you could talk more about the agency and the strategies employed by the women that you look at and that you come close to, especially by trying to overcome this judicial marginalization. Do they wrap these sexual crimes in other crimes? Do they demand that just participating in the killing is not enough? They want rape to be on the record as well. How does it play into the discourse that is happening in the courtroom? This is a fascinating story, and I'm just also curious about geography here, because you seem to have brought the cases from the part of Ukraine that was Soviet before 1939. I wonder how this would change looking into Eastern Galicia, Western Ukraine. These women, for the most part, if they survive, they are repatriated to Poland, but do you have comparative cases? For Frank, thank you. I beg to differ with the use of the word insignificant. I wonder if you could explain. You didn't put it in quotation mark. I mean, I can guess what you mean, but it's sort of repeating the marginalization in the language. I also wonder about the use of the word helpless, because in some way everybody is helpless. But then you show cases in which these people escape, hide, pass. I mean, they seem to be, the survivors seem to be extremely active. And then I wonder how this group, and I agree that they're the majority, but do you have a way to see how many of them are the newly poor and how many of them are the proletariat of Polish Jewry? Polish Jewry goes through dramatic impoverishment in the 1930s, and there are data from joint help, etc. And I wonder if these people differ in how they take their situation, if they had been sort of more middle class, and those that had been poor before the war. Dora, thank you so much. I was wondering if there are any efforts in trying to reach out to other private archives that might not be on site, that maybe survivors' families who left the city or to even left the country might have with them. And Michal, thank you so much for this. And again, just to be the devil's advocate, I wonder if we're not overdoing the stereotype of Ostjude who doesn't speak German, doesn't have any education, and is a tailor. Because I bet that among these people there are perfectly fluent in German, gymnasium-educated plus individuals. And just on the side of cross-reading archives, I see these people being mentioned as arrivals in 38, 39, and the horror stories that they're telling locally in places that are sometimes their original hometowns. So they are seen, and they have this strange status there as well. They are described through the lens of the locals, the people who came from Vienna. But thank you so much for these two panels.
Thank you. Before we continue, I think we'll, in a second.
Oh, it's actually very related.
Okay, then go on.
So this is, I guess, basically an extension of one of Natalia's points, just thinking about the role of poverty and thinking of marginalization and whether class issues in itself should be considered as grounds for marginalization. I was thinking of Natan Mayer's recent book, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, which ends, it's a discussion of outcast or marginal figures in East European Jewry, and it ends in 1939, so it's a somewhat different context, very different context in a lot of respects. But the way that he describes the marginality there isn't based just on how much money people have, but it's people who either are unable to survive on their own without crime or without being dependent on charity. So people like beggars or mentally or physically disabled or criminals. So in a context where there was a lot of poverty, I'm wondering the extent to which we can view class itself as a form of marginalization, or if that's a way of thinking about the society as a whole.
Thank you. I would stop though for now, please. Afterwards, sorry, it's just too many questions at once, so we'll just go through now with Marta, Frank, Dora, and Michal. Before we do so, just one other thing. Eva, I've seen that you've raised your hand, and also Dieter, if you're still with us, I know that you had a question. We will not forget about it, and then we'll head over to you. So, Marta, if you can start answering.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. First of all, I want to address the question of Julie. Julie, thank you so much. So this photos from the crime scene, photo of Andrusev is included to this criminal case. because the Soviets were trying to bring all perpetrators to the exact places of, for example, of mass shootings, places of ghettos where ghettos were located, and to make some sketches and so on. And I find these photos very important for us because on the one hand, we can learn about the whole procedure of investigation, but what is more important, we can see the perpetrator on the side and his facial expression, and to see, the body language of perpetrators. So I think these photographs are very important for us as researchers, and we should include them to our analysis. And the other question of Natalia about the agency of those women who testified about sexual violence. I think that this is the main point, actually. We should talk about those women and in terms of agency, because many of them were struggle actually with the Soviet authorities to bring the truth and their perspective about the gender dimensions of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. And considering, all of you know that Ukraine was divided into different occupation zones. And we have also different cultural backgrounds of those women. And to my knowledge, I am dealing with the cases from many localities. First of all, I was looking for Galicia, but most of my cases are not from Galicia. And I think that the Soviet project of emancipation, of women's emancipation, had to do a lot with these issues. Because it's one of the reasons, because those Soviet Jewish women, I think, were more willing to talk about this openly. And the second issue, I think, that contributed to the agency of women was the second issue is the whole procedure. The most cases, very vivid cases with very vivid stories, we have from later courts, later tribunals. Why? Because in 43, 44, 45, the period of procedure was very short. Some process of investigation and court and execution actually of those perpetrators lasts, for example, 1 or 2 or 3 days. So the Soviet investigators were not willing to have a long investigation, let's say. That's why many women were marginalized in this case, and the Soviets had a lot of other testimonies in order to execute or punish hardly those men, first of all men. That's why they neglect those testimonies. Later, when we had a very long period, for example, a trial of Andrusiv, they were hunting for him more than 20 years. And during this period, they gathered a lot of testimonies actually. And the whole process of investigation, he was caught in Romania in 65, and the whole process was last year. And we have a lot of different testimonies from different people in this case. So the second reason why we have a lot of testimonies in later period, 50s, 60s, is connected to this procedure. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Frank.
Okay. Thank you, Natalia, for your comment and on being cautious with my wording. Yes, of course, I think it's an important aspect. I'm just swelling with the methodology in my project, and I found this project by the Polish researcher Agnieszka Dauksza, who is trying to say that while Hilberg's concept bystander perpetrators and victims is not really helpful, we must we rather need to focus on the majority of victims who were helpless or insignificant, as she says. Insignificant is, of course, from the perspective of the perpetrators here, from the Germans. So they, in my opinion, they in this context, in this forced labor context, they had no economic, intellectual, or institutional agency. So this is the idea to describe the fate of the wide majority of people who did not survive, not only labor camps, but later, of course, the extermination camps. And of course, you're right. We speak about 75% of impoverished Jews before the war. I mean, we have the study of, I don't recall the author from 39. I'm not sure, Lederman. I'm not sure. Anyways, we know that this is a class issue. First of all, a question of social status, if survive or not. But still, how to approach this majority? I mean, still, this is kind of an issue for me at least. So thank you for this remark.
Thank you. Dora is next.
I have a very short answer. Thanks a lot for the question. Yes, we are constantly trying to reach out. I'm not aware of any other Jewish archives nearby Szeged, but we are reaching out to members of the Szeged Jewish community and also Jewish residents of Szeged who might have very valuable documents and artifacts. So this is something that's ongoing, and we are really doing our best.
Thank you. Michal?
Thank you for these two remarks, interconnected and very important ones. And of course, I realized that I have mentioned at one moment that I'm not trying to make them into a uniform group, and perhaps I haven't mentioned it enough. I have picked the group which really is socially low, is relatively coherent to highlight a phenomenon. But I have not done that to claim that this was a coherent group. I think the group of, and I'm not researching the so-called Ostjuden in Vienna as such, right? But of course, this was a very diverse group in religiosity, in social standing, in language, in all kinds of ways. And so that I think is very important. And now, and Natalia, I'd love to talk to you about what you see on the Polish side. We'll do that. We'll do that later. I realize that class is an imperfect label, but it's also a label which works, and it triggers the discussion now. I also think that the two categories of people who have migration history from a certain territory that comes with some kind of burden and judgments about them, and social standing is something which is connected in the sense that, not in a sense of causality, but it reinforces each other. There's perhaps some kind of intersectionality to be talked about here. And it's of course complicated by the fact that some of it is social reality and some of it is perception, right? So I think this has to be brought into the picture. Perhaps last remark here is, so a lot of this is categorization and perception. I think my paper was more on the side of, how they were seen by the Czechoslovak border officials. However, I'd also think that financial resources, but also social capital is something that helps you to migrate. Perhaps you can go in completely other direction, or looking at the same border, then you can pay a smuggler. And I think your chances are not perfect, but your chances improve when you can do this, and also improve because perhaps you treat it differently by the border officials, or you can simply bribe them, so that it's not completely disconnected from what resources you really have.
Thank you. We are quite running out of time already, so let's just do the last round of the 3 questions we have already. That is one question in the room, that is Eva, and that is Dieter. Dieter asked Michal, did you find protocols of the border guards that testified on behalf of the refugees? Let's collect these 3, so let's go over to Eva and her question.
Thank you very much for this fascinating 2 panels. I just want to discuss 2 sources which maybe can be important for you. The first source for Jon, I will share it for everybody because I think it's a great opportunity now to make comparison in an easiest way. This is a data collection of the Hungarian Jewish archives. The title is Communism is a Jewish Question, and I think Jon knows this source, that it's amazing to see how the Communist Party has reoccupied all of the questions of the Second World War without any respect, or almost any respect to the Holocaust and the suffering of the Jews. And I think it's extremely important to start thinking about it, what happened after the Second World War, with the help of the in-group sources as Jewish community sources. The second idea is to Dori. I don't know what happened in Romania, Ukraine, in Czechoslovakia, etc., but in Hungary, a huge interview survey was conducted in the late 80s with the second generation of the Jewish survivors. And I'm sure that this generation mentioned what happened with the parents during this late 40s, 50s. And I hope it will be accessible next year. And I think this is a beautiful source to check the transgenerational submission of knowledge, now not the trauma, but the knowledge about the Jewish life, about the Jewish community, about the communist oppression. And on the other hand, I think it's also a very fundamental source for understanding the everyday life of the Jewish communities in Hungary during the communism. So this was my 2 remarks. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Eva, and I'm sorry.
Thanks a lot,
again.
Eva.
Yes, sorry that I interrupted you beforehand, so let's collect your question as well.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this very inspiring panel. My question goes for Marta. Hi, Marta, it's good to see you. In one moment in your presentation, you present a testimony of a survivor, and you say that some women describe sexual violence in a very open way. And I was just wondering what kind of reasons you could put forward by explaining why some women described their experiences very openly and some of them just like kept silent. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Just a last question, then I think we really have to stop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I raised my hand first, but okay. Thank you so much for the panel. So my question to Frank has been asked by Natalia. Thank you so much. And left a question for Jon. I'm wondering if you can say something about non-Jews who supported persecuted Zionists. I mean, Romanians, maybe not only Romanians, because I'm thinking in comparison to the Soviet Ukraine, when persecution of Zionists started, ordinary people become dissidents, I mean Ukrainians, Russians, Crimean Tatars who started to protest against persecutions of Zionists and Jews. And a couple of questions to Marta. Could you please elaborate about your methodological approaches to such topic as a rape, and also particular to the trials which you use? And another question is, you talk mostly about Ukrainian policies who rape Jewish women. Did you come across any cases of Germans or Volksdeutsche who rape Jewish women? If yes, then what sort of punishment they received, if any? And last one, I'm curious if you have any comparative approach to non-Jewish victims of rape, because to see what is the unique in Jewish case, it can be also interesting to look at non-Jewish cases in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll start with a short question to Michal, then Jon, Dor, and Marta.
Thank you, Dieter, for the question. I'm not sure if I understood it well, but all of these protocols were written by the financial guard, by the border officials, and reproduced what they felt the statement of the refugee was. So perhaps I would just add that it's interesting that they were writing down these things at all, because they didn't have to do that. At the border, you can send someone back without much of a procedure, so that they were probably ordered to do this, to record certain cases. But they certainly don't do it for the hundreds and thousands of people whom they find and simply send back in the short, as they call it, in the short way. Yeah. Perhaps we can talk about this more later.
Thank you. Jon.
Yes, thank you very much, Eva, first of all, for the resource you pointed out. I was aware of it, but it's good that it's in the chat now, and it's interesting that it can be downloaded, so that's very, very important. As about similarities and comparisons, I think as more and more people are looking into these, so post-war fate of the Jewish communities and the way in which they related to with the communist regime, I think more and more nuances and similarities, but also differences would come to light. I can tell you that in April we had a conference here in Manchester. It was titled Jewish Dissidence in the Eastern Bloc. It was attended among others by Sander Gilman, Cathy Gelbin from University of Manchester, Anna Sterschis from Toronto, and there were several others, very good presenters. Yes, the comparative side would be more and more interesting in the near future, I think. As about Anna's question, that's a very interesting one. Non-Jews who supported the Zionists. When I heard the question, I thought about it, whether there was anyone helping them. And I think we have to keep in mind some chronology. I think in the first maybe 4 years after the war, so 1945, 1948, yes, there was some collaboration between various minorities groups, probably because of my interest in churches, I discovered more evidence about collaboration between churches, so Greek Catholics, Roman Catholics, and the Jewish community. And they kind of tried initially to have a common approach, that they tried to resist together to various communist intrusions. But they were unsuccessful. In 1948, and that year is a turning point in Romanian post-war history, because that year the communists successfully replaced the leadership not only of the Jewish community, but also of churches, the leadership of the Romanian Orthodox Church, the leadership of actually the Greek Catholic Church was disbanded, was banned. The Roman Catholic Church became non-official because the Concordat was also abolished. So yes, initially there was a desire to kind of collaborate, but already after 1949, many of these people started to be imprisoned, and the voices defending them were less and less. That was my impression.
Thank you, Jon. I fear that we have lost Dora for now, so let's continue with Martha.
Thank you so much for this question about silence. And it's a very important question because nowadays we have a lot of studies about sexual violence and silencing sexual violence and factors which contributing to this phenomena. So I think that we have different aspects in this regard. The first aspect is cultural ideas about the sexuality in general. So we know that many victims of sexual violence could face distrust, they fear of being blamed for provoking violence. And we know that some women, female survivors, Holocaust survivors, actually after the war were blaming for prostitution. So they were afraid of being marginalized, excluded from the community. They were afraid to lose their beloved ones, and so on and so on. So where many factors contributed to this, cultural ideas. So the other is the personal attitude. I see the big difference between different women. And it depends on a personality of woman, what she defined important, and if she has a lot strengths to approach this question, to address this question. Because, for example, when I dive into the document about Berdychev, about Lisa Hora, it was a labor force camp for Jews. We have a lot of men's testimonies about women who were raped, systematically raped there. And those women approached Jewish men and described their horrors, nightmares, and they expressed vividly that they wanted to be killed, but in order to avoid rapes. And those men actually told that almost all women there were raped. And we have women's testimonies from who survived the Berdychev, Lisa Hora camp, and they refused to talk about this topic. Or sometimes women talk about other women who were raped, but not about themselves. But at the same time, we have testimonies of other women and men who name their names among the rape victims. So we have these personal issues, personal attitudes. But the very important role played actually political factor. When we see that Soviet investigators are insisting on the issue of sexual violence, women are more willing to talk about this. And it's obvious that in many cases, when we talk about high-profile officers, high-profile collaborators, Soviet investigators were more willing to hear about this, were more willing to keep silence when women speak up, because in many cases we could trace the interest of Soviet investigators and how this contribute actually to the women's agency and women's willingness to talk about sexual violence or to keep silence. So the next question, yes, we have materials about Germans and Volksdeutschers. Actually, Volksdeutschers, their strategy of defense was very interesting because they talked about Rassenschande, actually, and they talked we were So Germans told us that we are true Germans, and because of Russian laws, Nuremberg laws, we cannot have sexual relations with Jewish women. And this was one of the line of justification of defense strategies for local Volksdeutschers. But in many cases, we have many testimonies that they were very cruel, actually, towards local women. And sometimes they, because they have a privileged position, more privileged even than Ukrainians, for example, or local Russians. And sometimes they abuse their power and turn many Jewish women into sex slaves during their service during Nazi occupation. Okay, and I will compare, actually, my next goal is to compare those cases when the cases where Germans or locals were put on trial and accused of sex crimes. Regarding the Jewish and non-Jewish victims of sexual violence, yes, we have in many cases, actually, we have Ukrainian women who spoke about the sexual violence that they experienced from the same men, same collaborators. And it's obvious for me that also political factor played a key role in this investigation. When a woman, for example, was a partisan member of Soviet partisan, or was a very active communist, or occupy some high position in this power structure, her testimonies were taken very seriously. Those women could, to gain this justice in these settings. But ordinary Jewish women and ordinary Ukrainian women, for them it was more complicated. So two political factors played a key roles: the personality of perpetrator and their position in the power relations during the occupation, and the personality of the victim herself. So this played a crucial role, I think. And when we approach those processes, we should keep in mind that the main goal was not only revenge in Soviet Union, especially in Soviet Ukraine, but the other main goal was to defeat all enemies of the state. That's why, because we know that Ukraine nationalist underground movement was very strong almost 10 years after the war. So we, in the Western Ukraine, we had war after war. And for Soviets was very important to put all those enemies of the states, all those bourgeoisie nationalists on trial and accuse them of severe crimes, and yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta. Dora, do you have something to add still?
I'd also only like to express my gratitude to Eva for bringing up this very important source, and I'm just looking forward to the publishing of these interviews. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I fear that that's all the time that we have left. I think it's a great thing as well for us that we have to force the discussion to stop on the third day of a conference, and I think it just shows that was very rewarding to put together these panel on narratives of the marginalized. So thank you very much to all your questions. Thank you for all the presentations today. Before we end now, I would just like also to hear some final remarks still by Stephen. Stephen, as you know, is the director of the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, and at the moment here a colleague of ours at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. So, Stephen, the floor is open for you, and thank you again for all the questions.
Okay, so let's jump right in. I'll do my best to be very brief, and this is a multi-day conference. Always sounds like a good idea, but the truth is, it's equal parts intellectually exhilarating as it is exhausting. To be surrounded by this temporarily constructed community of scholars, as engaging as it is a beautiful thing. But I'm sad to say that it seems that a hybrid conference is in some ways more exhausting than one in person. Alas, as Hyman Roth said in Godfather 2, this is the business we have chosen, Michael. I'd like to offer just 3 impressions or reflections inspired by the conference sessions, as well as my own experience at the Fortunoff Video Archive for more than a decade now. We've been digging very deep into archival sort of micro-histories and case studies. So let's pull back from a sort of macro perspective, a macro-archival perspective, if that's even a thing. Impression number 1, survivors as documents, documents as survivors. Not far from here on Judenplatz, there's a remarkable memorial to the Holocaust by Rachel Whiteread. And if you haven't had a chance to visit, I hope you do get a chance. It's a concrete box, kind of a shelfless, inaccessible library with countless inverted books with the spines hidden. It's open to interpretation, I suppose, but my impression is that these rows of inverted books represent the victims, many of whom will remain unnamed, hence no titles, no authors, whose life stories were cut short, will never be known, written, or read. According to an article from The Guardian published at the time, Simon Wiesenthal, we have to mention Simon Wiesenthal, we're at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute after all, who had fought for the memorial's construction for years, told the crowd that had gathered there that this monument, and I quote, "This monument shouldn't be beautiful, it must hurt." And archives are also, in a way, monuments like this monument, and they should also hurt. Every precarious archive we looked at today is a potential splinter causing discomfort, a challenge to preconceived notions that can't be ignored. At the Fortunoff Video Archive, this is one of the goals from the very beginning. In part, the taping initiative began in 1979 as a reaction to the Holocaust television series in '78, which many survivors found disturbing. These Hollywood popular cultural representation of their experience seemed inadequate, inaccurate, inauthentic. And so the taping of testimony could help build an alternative counter-cinematic response to an unnecessary corrective. So as an audiovisual monument, the Fortunoff Video Archive's content was intended to hurt in the best way possible, as Wiesenthal suggested. But it also hurts to build an archive of this kind. And from the earliest days, thanks in part to the experience of one of our founders, Dori Laub, who himself was a child survivor and a psychiatrist, there was an understanding that the act of giving testimony was deeply painful. And the awareness of this pain resulted in an interview methodology and an apparatus of care that is really at the core of the Fortunoff Video Archive. So it reopens wounds. This act of giving testimony reopens wounds, and it hurts, just like building the monument on Judenplatz was designed to do. As the cliche goes, we Jews are the people of the book. As an information professional, however, I like to point out that we better to say that we are perhaps the people of the archive or the people of the effective post-destruction documentation strategy, but it seems like people of the book is a little bit more pithy, so we'll go with that. So it's no wonder that the form of the book plays a role in Whiteread's memorial. But I don't think the people of the book analogy in the monument solely applies to Jews. It says to each of us that when we are alive, our books are being written in media res. Our final chapters are incomplete, and like the books in the memorial or the precarious archives we've been examining, if we don't act now, there are many stories that may go unwritten and untold. Like the at-risk archives we've been discussing, the Fortunoff Archive captured interviews on tapes. Had we not, these stories would have been lost. Yehuda Bauer wrote, and I quote, "Testimonies are one of the most important sources of our knowledge of the Holocaust because the Germans tried to murder the murder, prevent Jewish documentation. These survivors and their testimonies are documents walking among us on 2 legs. They might be documents on 2 legs, but they are not historians." And Professor Jeffrey Hartman, the archives faculty advisor until 2016, wrote that the goal of taking testimony was not to make historians out of these survivors, but to document the tragedy in its full human detail. In this sense, testimony is an act of releasing the already existing documents, the stories, the words, the emotions that are held inside these books with their spines obscured, so painfully ignored for so long by the surrounding society, which was unwilling to read and listen. I'd like to think that your work and the papers that you presented highlight these marginalized, precarious sources to scholarship is related to Bauer's statement, but perhaps turned inside out. You're all mostly working with paper documents, not people, not documents on two legs walking among us, but human beings and human stories trapped in paper form, but also these voices still waiting to be heard, like the survivors who stepped forward to give testimony at great emotional cost for the first time. The goal then in this inverted liberatory process is to take these collections of hitherto ignored documentation and to pull the living beings from the wreckage and return their story to the wider stream of historiography. In doing this work, like the founders of the Video Archive, we must remain sensitive to these survivors, even in human as well as in paper form, to provide a safe space for them to give their testimony, to protect them from harm, to understand that they have suffered enough, and that this final act of transmission is indeed painful. In the case of precarious archives, that sensitivity might include an understanding that the owners of these collections might view the intrepid researcher with some suspicion as an outsider, who seems imperial in their hunger to do good, to collect as many sources and as much information as possible to use in their own research to get the scoop, while chafing at dealing with complex issues of patrimony, of intransigent families, protective guards, or protective archivists, dysfunctional organizations holding precious materials. That means we might need to place some limits on ourselves as researchers to balance the needs of historical research with respect for the lives now past, at least an awareness of the potential ethical dilemmas one faces when reading between the lines and chipping away at the privacy of our paper people. I can't help but think of Kinga's anonymization of the medical records from the Jews of Szeged. Whatever choice we make, though, we should remember that these aren't just archives and documents, they are symbolic people. Impression 2, a few thoughts on archival sources and history, mostly plagiarized from smarter people than myself. Several speakers over the last 2 days alluded to Walter Benjamin and his call for brushing history against the grain. And that seems to me to be exactly what we're trying to do. We do this by lifting up these marginalized, homeless, precarious collections from oblivion, by building more complex and complete narratives at the individual level through cross-archival research and identifying potential silences like Alex and Ildiko have done, by pushing the very boundaries of what we refer to as testimony, from applications for aid as memoirs to drawings of children depicting life in wartime and post-war Hungary, to objects, even a backpack of reconstructed from competing family memories. This object, like a photograph, was, I think, worth more than 1,000 words. So I do think our work, your work, helps us to brush history against the grain. Skipping ahead. It's clear that we've only begun to scratch the surface on this front, and that applies not only to the precarious archives we've looked at this conference, but even archives like the Fortunoff Video Archive. While our archive is secure in Yale's digital preservation repository and hardly an unknown resource per se, researchers here too have only begun to scratch the surface. We've had 4,400 testimonies, 12,000 hours of recorded material in a dozen different languages, more than a dozen different languages, and only a fraction of them have ever been used in teaching or research since they were recorded. And work is only being done now to transcribe them in their original language. So, and we need to do that in order to bring them to the researchers who have the languages, who can work with these important historical materials and reconstruct the national narratives. So it's not just new sources that we've come across, but it's also old sources revisited that we need to read both of them against the grain. And that's how it's always been in every period in this very short history of Holocaust studies. Each of these new or alt-neu sources advanced the project that we're all part of. Yet, despite the arrival of new sources, after the end of even the Cold War, for instance, Tim Snyder, our current faculty advisor, has mentioned that we still lack synthetic national histories of the Holocaust in many countries impacted by the Shoah, emphasizing again the importance of sources like the ones we've been discussing today. He notes, and I quote, "We need archives because we need history. Archives are there to make sure that what we see is fresh and authentic and convincing. Our understanding of the Holocaust is something that must continue to evolve as we do fresh and new research. If it doesn't evolve, it starts to become implausible and inaccessible. Learning more and telling the story in different ways, that depends on maintaining an archive. And we need to care for these sources so that we can create a living history and evolving a persuasive history. Snyder also adds that survivor testimonies and other ego documents are especially important because they surprise us, and I think that was quite clear from all of the papers during the last 3 days. They surprise us because they don't always say things that we expect them to say. And that's extremely important for historical research. These precarious archives, too, can explode conventional myths that have taken root over time, and they are therefore as precious as they are precarious. A final point on the nature of sources and their value, and a reaction perhaps to the temporal composition of the presentations at this conference. There were only a few sources from the post-war period, and I think only one or two that stretched the timeline back into the pre-war period. But I think that that might be natural since we're at the Wiener Wiesenthal Institute, that we would focus on this sort of constrained period of the Holocaust. But I do think it's important that, like the Fortunoff Video Archive, we need to recognize that without the pre-war period, the backstory, the description of the survivors' post-war period, we can't really begin to understand the Holocaust period and what is lost. So I'm basically arguing that we need to push back and forward our ideas of what are valuable sources for this type of research. And to paraphrase historian David Engel, we need to bring in more resources that help us break down the walls that divide the story of Jewish life and culture in each country from the study of the Holocaust as a separate phenomenon. That just means expanding our time frame. Impression 3, we're almost done. Impression 3, okay, and I hope it's not too banal, but I'll go ahead and take the risk. I just want to underscore how precarious the entire project of historical research, scholarship, and reconstruction is, particularly right now. It's always been this way, especially as Frank noted in his remarks, when it comes to Jewish history. But I have to say the current political climate on both sides of the Atlantic, for some reason, makes this precarity so much more painfully palpable. It's not just that sources are precarious, but the very institutions that help scholars make use of these sources in this multi-generational project to write and rewrite the history of the Holocaust are precarious. And I think it's safe to say that everyone in this room would believe that the Holocaust is perhaps one of the central turning points in the history of the 20th century, if not human civilization, a civilization that right now, again, seems particularly precarious, not just due to impending climate doom, but also impending political climate doom, which in some way I think is related to this post-Cold War world we inhabit that no longer seems to care about the humanities. Or place value on the humanities. The market has spoken, and humanities degrees don't prepare you for any kind of productive work per se, because we live in a society that no longer seems to value things that are unquantifiable in terms of financial growth and return on investment. So it seems what I'm trying to say here, and again, I apologize if this is banal, but there's a bigger story here that's under the surface, and that is that these precarious archives equal precarious humanities, which equals a precarious humanity. The continued marginalization of these archives, in fact, all archives, and the lack of appreciation for and investment in history and the humanities casts a spotlight on the precarity of the entire project of building a functioning civil society. Maybe the lack of support for archives in the humanities is a tiny canary in a much, much bigger coal mine. Not only are all archives precarious in one way or another, but even well-resourced archives like the Fortunoff Video Archive intentionally or unintentionally lock up precarious voices, marginalized voices. They do so by enacting restrictive policies or by making choices on how to describe or index and make discoverable and accessible their materials. Sometimes these choices can prevent precarious voices from emerging from even the most well-funded organization. One example of a precarious corner of our archive are the dozens of testimonies of Roma survivors in our collection. Many of these testimonies, recorded in the 1990s, lack conventional legal release forms that would allow our legal counsel to make them more readily available to researchers. So they sit essential resources that could help us write the still unwritten history of the Roma genocide. Sources locked up and unavailable to the Roma scholars who need them. What can we do to ensure that these and other precarious voices inside our collections are liberated and can make their impact on how history is constructed? So I'll go ahead and end there. It seems to me this conference, conferences like this one, are a contribution to the effort to build an archive of tomorrow, an archive that will allow us to reconstruct a truer, more inclusive, more authentic vision of the past. Perhaps this is somewhat utopian or maybe heterotopian, since again, we're trying to do our best to disturb the peace, to brush history against the grain by unlocking these sources. But I think that's the type of precarious project I want to be a part of, and I think you do too. And so with the culture wars and memory wars raging now on both sides of the Atlantic, it seems like it's an effort that's more important now than ever. And I'd just like to ask Julie if you could come up to say a closing remark. Those were the closing remarks. There's now one closing remark.
This is last a closing remark, and simply a thank you to the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for hosting.
Thank you. I just want to thank again the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for hosting this wonderful conference. For me, really rewarding, and so after however many years, so special that it happened. And especially Miriam Wilhelm and Marianne Winsberger, these are for you. They really, yeah, this wouldn't have happened without these wonderful women who took over so much of the logistics, a lot of it a bit unexpectedly, and they really worked to make everything go as smoothly as possible in these precarious times. Eva.
I just want to repeat to thank you, Julie, bringing this wonderful idea to the Institute. And yes, first of all, thanks to you all here in this room and also in the universe of the Zoom to bring these amazing new research findings and ideas and questions to the floor, because it was really a kind of wow, extremely inspiring workshop. I would also like to say my special thanks go to our beautiful staff here in the house. Maybe you know that now that we are a very, very small, a kind of microscopical staff here, and even more smaller during the pandemic. And Marianne, Miriam, Sandro, where are you? Sandro, Martin, Manfred, and many other colleagues supported us. Jana, absolutely, sorry. Supported us to be as easy, as flexible as possible. So thanks again. It was really a wonderful experience again. Yes, and the Geli in the background, and it's really sorry that she cannot take part here, but all of you has a connection to her, I think, and she's also supporting us during this a couple of days, although it was not her task. So thanks again. We wish you a very, very safe travel from the lockdown to Vienna, and yes, maybe having another world without lockdowns and COVID, etc., and see each other. No, don't forget, we were extremely happy to see so much ex-fellow and current fellow here in the Institute, and maybe future fellows as well. So our call is open. Please don't hesitate to apply. So thank you again. Bye-bye.
So just one thing that Geli prepared and sent to all of, I think, no, she only sent it to us. So I have printed certificates if someone needs like a certificate of participation in terms of traveling safely. And yes, that's just my final remark. Thank you all.